Welcome to Class Matters, the podcast where we ask the question, what would our country look like if it were governed by and for the working class? Class Matters is a project of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute. I'm Catherine Isaac, Executive Director. In this episode, Adolph Reed Jr. talks with Chicago Teachers Union President Jesse Sharkey and Professor Daniel Moak about the COVID-19 pandemic and the strong debate it has provoked about the organization and function of our K-12 education system. Welcome, President Sharkey and Professors Moak and Reed.
Well, thanks for having us. Good to be here.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, although many have praised the sacrifices and the extraordinary efforts of teachers in the midst of the pandemic, others have revived common criticisms about kids falling behind, about teachers' unions that are too powerful, and the claim that private alternatives can do better than public schools, or what some critics are now calling government schools. While the pandemic is exceptional, these charges are not new. In one sense, they reflect a more than 40-year attack on public goods and services of all sorts. Today, we will discuss where are these claims coming from, what do they mean for education, and how are teachers and parents fighting to protect and expand public education? So let's start with introductions, and then I'll turn it over to Adolph Reed. Jesse Sharkey is president of the Chicago Teachers Union, which has been at the forefront of protecting and expanding education as a public good in one of our nation's largest cities. In two historic strike efforts in 2012 and 2019, the CTU organized around a vision of public education that confronted powerful elites who supported privatization and undermining the ability of teachers' unions to advocate for students and teachers and to protect the quality of public education. The strike secured demands such as money for reducing overcrowded classes, pay increases, and helped prevent school closures and layoffs. The CTU also successfully made the case for broader public investments in areas like housing and transportation. As he steps down from leading the CTU, Sharkey plans to return to the classroom. Next, we have Daniel Moak, who is an assistant professor of African American Studies at Ohio University. His forthcoming book, From the New Deal to the War on Schools, Race, Inequality, and the Rise of the Punitive Education State, traces how during the 1960s, schools were burdened with the responsibility of solving a number of social problems, including poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Although this faith in education channeled dollars to schools, policymakers quickly began blaming schools, demonizing teachers, and called for privatization when these problems continued. He'll be joining the Department of Government at Connecticut College in the fall. And finally, Adolph Reed Jr., who has been involved in working class politics for more than half a century. He's Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests include American and Afro-American politics and political thought, urban politics, and American political development. He serves on the board of the Debs Jones Douglas Institute and is the author of several books, most recently, The South, Jim Crow and Its Afterlives. Again, welcome everyone to Class Matters. And Adolph, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Catherine. And welcome, President Sharkey and Professor Moak. So, President Sharkey, just to open up with you for a little bit, can you tell our listeners a little bit about who the CTU represents and its place in the Chicago labor movement?
Yeah, sure thing. The CTU represents public school educators in the city of Chicago. About 25,000 members who are actively working in the schools. We're talking about people who are paraprofessionals, that is, open the buildings, staff the offices, do that basic work of keeping the buildings running, interacting with families. Then the pre-K through 12 teachers in the CPS system, and then also all the clinicians who deliver support services, counseling, physical therapy, everything for our special needs students, deal with the worst crises that kids get into, et cetera. So that's what we do. And it's Local 1 of the AFT. History goes, I think the first teachers union formed in Chicago in the early 1900s in response to tuberculum and the water supply. And so it's got a long history. It's a democratic union. Got a lot of member involvement. I'd say we've got well over 1,000 activists in our union, which is part of what makes it, notable. We represent a lot more than nothing. And that's kind of who we are.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have to say, the CTU has been a beacon for all of us who are concerned, not just in Chicago, but around the country, with the struggle for working people. right, of whatever age, basically, but especially with public institutions. So as we mentioned in the intro, one of the threats that's stalking public education and teachers unions in particular is privatization, which basically boils down to giving provision of public services over to private profit-making enterprises. President Mark Demonstein of the American Postal Workers Union, who was a guest a couple of episodes ago, describes what he calls the 4 Ds of privatization. First, officials defund the service, which they often justify by claiming that it will be possible magically to do more with less, which is one I've never been able to figure out. Defunding leads to the next D as they degrade the service, cutting standards of quality and access, which what would they intend to foment discontent among people who depend on the service. And this is accompanied by what he calls the 3rd D, as they demonize workers who deliver the service, blame them for the decline in quality that results directly from the first 2 Ds. And if successful, that sets the stage for the 4th D. They dismantle the public service with privatization. Now, President Sharkey, to what extent does President Demonstein's description sound familiar in a relation to your own experience regarding the Chicago Public Schools?
Well, I think it's spot on. The thing that immediately comes to my mind is the cleanliness of our buildings, and a particular campaign in Chicago that was actually launched by a guy who was the chief administrative officer of Motorola before coming over to work for the schools, this guy, Tim Cawley, who privatized the custodial services behind the claim that they would have much cleaner schools for way less money. They handed over the schools to Aramark, Sodexo, and Sodexo Magic. And they brought Zamboni-style floor cleaners into the schools and said, here's an example of how capital is going to help keep your schools cleaner. The problem, of course, is that all of our schools are multi-floor buildings. Most of them don't have elevators. You can't clean a classroom with a Zamboni because it has desks in it. It was a disaster from the start. Schools had never been dirtier, and it was profoundly demoralizing. And I'm sure that there are a lot of private schools that could appeal to just parents to come to a school that's just adequately maintained and isn't dirty and depressing. I will say that in our experience, the thing which sort of fights against that pattern is our demands. So we demanded cleaner schools. We've never been quiet about it. We spent a lot of effort sort of documenting what's wrong, making demands about how the schools should be cleaner, pointing to the culprits, and then sort of pointing out that really the antidote for that kind of privatization is democracy, has to do with giving us control over how the resources for our public schools are spent. And what it reveals on some level is that when push comes to shove, we actually don't have democratic controls over these institutions. And that's been one of the fundamental features about the way fights have played out. We also really made a point of trying to point out how racist the patterns are. So when you privatize services, the schools that have access to a more middle class, so white parent clientele in the richer parts of town, supplement their budgets by hiring extra staff or bringing in extra folks to keep buildings cleaner, or the buildings are more modern and easier to maintain in the first place. The places where we have the biggest problems, oldest buildings, lots of ways for rodents to get into the building, et cetera. Those are concentrated in Chicago and the city's south and west sides. And so it winds up replicating a racist pattern. And so, you see the kind of patterns of segregation, of racial inequality being reinforced by the privatization that's going on in the services. And it's happening in a number of areas, but that's one that I'd underline.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it also underscores the extent to which the CTU is a bulwark for parents, students, staff, and everybody who's concerned with the quality of public education, even down to keeping the schools clean.
I think there's a way in which sort of a lot of unions are worried about, if we speak up about this, if we put people in motion around a dirty schools campaign, it's going to undermine the credibility of our schools. And so we should keep quiet about it. And it's just like we have made it sort of our process, our method to call out what's wrong, but always to never punch down, always punch up. We're not blaming the custodians that have too much work. We're not blaming people for if people are complaining about it and unhappy, we should put them in front of a camera and also try to have a campaign where we can get the resources we need to make our schools better. Try to be really active advocates for what we need in our school communities. Because there's a lot of ways. That's not the only thing they're privatizing. Talk about dirty buildings. They're privatizing schools themselves. There's a move afoot to charterize big chunks of the school system, et cetera.
Right. And on that point, also, as you mentioned in the opening, Your schools and teachers have once again come under attack, but these criticisms of public education actually long predate the pandemic. So, Professor Moe, can you describe the nature of these critiques and where these attacks come from?
Yeah, so certainly these attacks are nothing new. And I think some of the best ways to understand where these attacks come from is to go back and see kind of the history behind some of these attacks. And I think a really important moment for understanding some of the origins of these attacks is ironically in the Great Society era. So if you go back to the 1960s, this is a moment where we begin to see some of the negative effects of automation and deindustrialization, basically declining access to good paying jobs in many communities really come into focus in a number of places throughout the country. However, this is also a moment when sort of the Democratic Party is really beginning to move away from its New Deal commitments to things like robust public job creation, redistributive taxation, and strong support for labor unions. And we actually see both parties and policymakers from both parties begin to embrace an idea that things like unemployment, poverty, racial inequality were not really the result of structural issues with the labor market, like deindustrialization or automation, but really about the skills that individuals brought to the labor market itself. So this is an important reinterpretation of the origins of why people are poor. So now if you're poor or unemployed, not because there aren't enough good paying jobs to go around, it's because you don't have the skills necessary to earn a good wage. And in this moment, education policy actually becomes really important.
Right.
It's posed as sort of a panacea to all of the problems like poverty, unemployment, racial inequality. So in the 1960s, we do get new federal funding for education, which is great, but you also get this new expectation that schools are going to be able to solve these problems. And the reality is that schools and teachers cannot solve these problems on their own. You can't solve the effects of deindustrialization or of shipping millions of jobs overseas or a shifting labor market where wages and union power have been significantly diminished. You can't solve those problems through school. But by the time we get to the 70s and 80s, we see policymakers from both political parties really begin to blame schools and teachers union for failing to do their jobs and sort of leading to greater inequality. So we see the emergence of critiques that public schools have become a monopoly, teachers unions have corrupted education, and schools are failing broadly and sort of leading to societal inequality, really the sort of demonization that President Dickinson was referring to in that earlier point. And this begins to serve as a wedge to calls for privatization of K through 12 education. And I think these attacks have certainly been heightened the closer that we get to the present day. We have sort of the social safety net gets shredded, basic public services are underfunded, declining wages, attacks on unions, and sort of the ultimate rise of pretty extreme inequality, which leaves schools and teachers kind of on their own to deal with these problems. And as you mentioned earlier, are expected to do more with less as they're facing their own budget cuts and declining pay. So I think schools and teachers have really become convenient scapegoats for cynical politicians and policymakers who really have no appetite to pursue the types of programs that would help address some of these broader structural problems brought about by the economic policies that both parties have been pursuing. And as I mentioned earlier, these attacks really have opened the door for privatizers, nonprofit organizations, and corporate interests who are frankly salivating at the prospect of dismantling public education and attacking teachers' union, all while trying to lay claim to this mantle of being truly concerned about equality or for the poor or
Right.
marginalized. I think I would say that a lot of these attacks on schools and teachers' unions come from people that are either intentionally or unintentionally looking to deflect political blame and attention from the failure of their own economic policies for the last 40 or 50 years, or from people that are looking to make money through dismantling public education. And a lot of times it's both.
Right. Well, I tell you, like in light of, that horrendous history of, scapegoating, how have teachers' working conditions changed in the last decade or so, President Sharkey? And what do those changes mean for students and for our education system overall?
I think before I answer that question directly, I would just say that, I agree with Professor Moak in the broad sort of sort of in terms of the broad direction of his comments, the particular mechanism by which the attack showed up in public education was to talk about sort of test score driven competition. And so there's an introduction of a market mechanism into our schools, and you see it through No Child Left Behind, Bush, and then Obama picks it up and raises to the top. But it's the idea that like we can measure the amount of input that schools give into students as measured by test scores, and then try to like back out, try to figure out the most productive parts of the system, and then do what capital does, which is close down the least productive parts and put investment into the most productive parts. Of course, we're talking about students and human beings in schools and communities, and so it's not all that simple. And the reason that it's important to recognize that is because I think that bears directly on what it was like to work in a school over the last decade and a half or so. Because when they started to say in Chicago in the late 90s, and then really but hitting pace in the early 2000s, we're going to be measuring the test scores in all the schools, and we will close the lowest performing schools. It meant that you could be a teacher who was expert in your craft, teaching in a poor neighborhood because you were dedicated to it, never had a bad job evaluation in your life, and you could lose your job through no fault of your own because your school was closed. And then if you were a veteran Black teacher, your chances of finding a new job would be extremely low. And they dressed this up with all kinds of fancy names. They called it a turnaround process. And by the way, we just settled a multi-million-dollar lawsuit with the Board of Education here that was 12 years in the making. Behind the charge of that was a racist process that it wound up discriminating against Black teachers in particular. So that settlement is a good thing. They abandoned the policy now, but it took a long time to achieve that. And what it meant is that people's work was stressed. It was sped up, all the sorts of things that you would expect, say, in an automobile parts factory, where they're retooling the industry. Those are all ideas and concepts that they applied to education through a number of specific mechanisms, usually on test scores, competition, threat of closing, et cetera. And what it meant that like schools became a really difficult place to work. And so it's not surprising to me that we've actually seen militancy and fight back in the education sector. They started off with a really idealistic set of things, come work in schools, we're going to change the world, teach for America. You had all these sort of idealistic appeals to young people to come into the schools and make the world better. And a lot of people bought it. I was certainly influenced by that thinking. I think that like in 1 year and sort of, in the neighborhood of 2005, I forget the exact year, something like 17% of the graduating class of Harvard applied to teach for America. It was a real kind of moment. People are coming into the industry, and then you got in, and what you discovered instead was just oppressive amounts of supervision, incredibly high pace of work, emphasis on student test scores, just a sort of an educational sweatshop that was unfolding with an attempt by people like Bill Gates, and various other edupreneurs trying to like get involved to control summative and formative assessment, to be able to like actually like make profit off every little part of the education process. In other words, it was a disaster. It was a disaster of a capitalist enterprise applying itself to the schools. And Fight Back that's the sort of the context in which Fight Back emerged there.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up because I think this is really helpful. And I think one of the things that we see when we look at other states or throughout the country is that we see tremendous teacher shortages associated with the declining conditions that President Sharkey was just talking about. As teachers have lost their autonomy, class sizes have gone up, teacher pay has sort of not kept up with inflation. In fact, I was just checking a little while ago, and the real value of average teacher salaries actually declined in 27 states from where it was 10 years ago. Wow. So wages are not keeping up. And we see massive teacher shortages across the country as there's higher turnover, people are leaving the profession, and fewer people want to get in part because of these worsening working conditions. And I think one of the things that we see in response is sort of a de-skilling of the teaching profession. They're looking to hire people that don't have the credentials, in part because that's the only way to get people to fill these jobs, where in any other field, people that have the same level of training, 12 to 13 years of education, would be making a lot more than $40,000 to $50,000 a year starting out. So it really has sort of created a crisis within the school, the sort of decline in teaching conditions.
And the narrative about failure, of course, then that's the impetus in some ways, right? I mean, that's some way the thing that gives them, a kind of the political force to attempt to force through a set of changes. Well, what justifies closing the schools in Black neighborhoods? Well, you call them failures. There's an attempt on the part of the privatizers to flip the narrative around. It's like, not that it's a travesty to be closing schools in Black neighborhoods. It would be a travesty not to close the schools in Black neighborhoods, because after all, what they claim they're doing is somehow improving education, making better education available. And, it's turned out they've done nothing of the sort.
Yeah, so I mean, you can see how this logic goes, and it's interesting to see the extent to which high stakes testing is at the core of it, right? So one point you made that especially was striking to me is that the test produces a product, basically, right? So the testing isn't simply bringing science to bear on making an assessment of how students are taught and how they learn. It actually produces a measurable commodity that provides a basis for closing schools, basically. And I mean, for shifting resources around. And it reminds me, if you can pardon an anecdote, a good friend of mine in the late 90s was president of the local school council at the Kenwood School, like in Chicago. And when they were having debates back and forth about teaching the test, like the point that he kept trying to make was that, well, the whole point of the test is to produce a bell curve distribution, right? So to produce winners and losers. And what happens when students in schools that are defined as schools for the losers do better on the test is redesigned to reimpose the distribution that produces them as losers again. So there's no way to win against this. But I think that also raises, and we've touched on it already, but this claim, what was you said, President Sharkey, that declaring schools and students failures, it becomes a justification for pulling the trigger to reallocate on resources. And lately we've been hearing a lot about the last few years that our students are falling behind now. But so what are they falling behind? But exactly, I mean, what's the benchmark that they're falling behind? Is it like Iceland, or what do people mean when they say the students are falling behind?
Software engineers, the tech sector needs. So in order to get someone up and being a successful software engineer by age 21, they've got to be doing some pretty sophisticated calculus when they're 11.
Right.
Apparently, is the way it works. Look, one of the things that I think is interesting about watching the education, I grew up in rural Maine. I grew up on a dirt road in rural Maine. And, there was a local school, and there were some folks that did religious homeschool. But for the most part, people were fairly satisfied with that school, or the schools in that part of the world, and around this country. I think it's interesting how much ground the right has been able to make on basically what's a very similar critique to the one I just made. They've sort of packaged this set of ideas of our curricular reform into this thing called the Common Core, which is really sort of a beat up or intensification as a curriculum and pushing sort of increasingly sophisticated concepts, especially in math and in reading skills, down in the curriculum so that people were doing stuff in third grade they'd previously done in sixth grade, et cetera, talking about how we were going to need to get, not only were we making the standards harder, but everyone needed to hit these standards, hit them sooner with consequences attached, et cetera. And there's a revolt against this. There's a revolt against it in rural America as well. Unfortunately, what's capturing that revolt in rural America are the people who say, this is a good argument against public school, period. Take your kids out. It wouldn't surprise me if there's a similar kind of thing going on in the city as well. We've been lucky enough in the city that we've had some social movements that have been able to push back against a number of those questions, et cetera. But at any rate, yeah, I mean, I just think that there's sort of some idea that somehow our schools are failing is a really pernicious idea, because it's taking what should be a public institution that needs to equip the next generation of our society with the tools they need to be self-fulfilled adults, to be participants in our public sphere, et cetera. And it replaces it with a really narrow conception of what success is based on test scores. You call it a commodity. It's a measurable number, which they can use as a way to try to promote students to make sure they're skilled for a particular section of the labor market, which the folks that wrote the Common Core, funded, et cetera, are paying attention to.
Well, and so that's interesting I think in a number of ways, but one of them is that the model of education that's connected to the Common Core that you bring to mind, or that you mentioned rather, brings to mind the old Vo-Tech schools in the textile districts of the Piedmont South, right? Where the mill staffed the schools, right? Provided the curriculum and tracked students, right, to the looms or to the foreman.
Or the office, right? People would type it for the office, right? But then not as many. And then the school would look like a mill, right?
Right. No, totally.
Rows and bells. You have to go
Totally.
someplace, right.
Yeah, I really just want to echo what both of you said earlier about how the narrative of failing schools is really pernicious. And I do think that's the right language. As you were saying, Adolf, the natural question to the students are falling behind trope is falling behind what? Because there really is no satisfying answer to that. And it feeds into this idea that K through 12 education should be all about a sort of race to the finish line or a race to the job rather than a collective experience of learning and growing together. I do think that this line of attack is part of an attempt to manufacture a crisis that has to be responded to. So if schools are failing, then something has to be done, or if students are falling behind, something has to be done. And this kind of provided the political momentum for pushing policies like No Child Left Behind under President Bush and Race to the Top under President Obama, both of which relied on and helped feed into manufacturing this failing schools narrative to help justify turning over public schools to private interests. Both of these policies really rely on high stakes standardized tests as an important tool in achieving this. And the idea here is that we need to continually give students these standardized tests to measure whether or not they're learning. And the high stakes part comes in because policymakers have tied things like teacher pay, school funding, or even a school's continued existence to performance on these tests. These are some of the turnaround strategies that President Sharkey was talking about earlier. And this really is where we see a lot of momentum with things like charter schools coming from. So charter schools are publicly funded schools, but they have a very different organizational structure, and many are run by for-profit companies. And they've really taken off as a way of introducing market incentives or competition into the public education system. We now have a ton of studies showing that there's really no evidence that charter schools outperform traditional public schools on these tests, but there are some real causes for concern. And just take a minute to name some of these. Charter schools have the ability to sort of choose their student bodies in a way that traditional public schools simply don't. So traditional public schools sort of have to take everyone that wants to go in a certain geographical district. But there are a number of ways in which charter schools can sort of choose the easiest students to educate or allow those students to enroll. One of the ways that they can do this is requiring very difficult applications in order to get in. And they also have the ability to push students out that aren't performing well or that require more time or resources to educate once they're in the charter school. And a lot of times this happens through really strict behavioral requirements or strict discipline policies that allow them to essentially push out students that they don't want to educate anymore. Another pretty consistent finding from a number of studies is that charter schools underserve students with severe disabilities or special needs, in part because this is a segment of students that are relatively expensive to educate, which means that they're not profitable to educate. And just to be clear, there are private companies and individuals making millions of dollars off of charter schools, and we have a lot of evidence that a lot of this money is never making its way to students. So there was a study just last year that found that of the roughly $4 billion that the federal government has spent on expanding charter schools over the last 15 years or so, over $1 billion of that money went to charter schools that either never opened or shut down after a few years of operation. And just to bring it back to teachers, charter school teachers are much less likely to be unionized, which is one of the reasons that billionaires like the Waltons of Walmart love them. They see it as a way of attacking the union movement more broadly. And charter school teachers tend to be less experienced. They are less satisfied with their jobs. They are less likely to be certified. And there's much higher rates of turnover than their counterparts in traditional public schools. So we're getting all of these negative consequences with no evidence of better outcomes, but we keep getting the argument that we need to do this because you have people from both parties continuing to push out this idea that the existing schools are failing and the students are falling behind.
Yeah. And also, I mean, like you bring to mind, I mean, just the flood of propaganda coming from everywhere and, left and right. Like you mentioned the Obama administration, the Clinton and Obama administrations weren't our friends weren't the friends of public education anymore than Republicans were. And at this point, we've come up against this tide of a strong media and elite narrative that teachers' unions are self-serving and that their interests are at odds with those of students and parents. So, for example, former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, and now as mentioned to our listeners, I know we all know that the DeVos family in 2016 was the 88th richest family in America. And Betsy spent much of her effort as the Education Secretary in the Trump administration, working to protect predatory private for-profit colleges that dupe people into saddling themselves with loan debt for promises that they'll qualify for jobs that never materialize. But DeVos said this year, and I'll quote her here, "Parents are sick of their children being held hostage to the political ambitions of the unions and their allies. This parent uprising will not stop until every family has education freedom," end quote. And of course, it's not just DeVos, who never spent a minute in a public school in her life. It's a mantra among foes of teachers' unions, both Democrats and Republicans again. That's also a charge that's been hurled at unions representing other public sector workers, including nurses and firefighters. And I can recall, I'm hearing people claim sometimes that teachers were selfish for caring about wages, benefits, and the conditions of their work at all. And if they really cared about the children, they wouldn't demand anything. And there'd be even more of them standing online in Staples before the beginning of the school year to buy the school supplies out of their inadequate salaries already. But even popular culture got into the act as Hollywood weighed in with two big budget, heavily hyped pro-charter school, anti-teachers union films that came out in the early 2010s. One was a documentary called Waiting for Superman, which is horrible. And the other was a drama called Won't Back Down, which actually came out the same year as the CTU strike in 2012. So I know, President Sharkey, that former Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and it's still very nice to be able to say former, and the elite media tried to paint the CTU in that same light, right? Like in the run-up to the 2012 strike. And they were all shocked to see how strong support for the union and its demands was among parents and in the community at large. It seems that Rahm and the others were, as my father often said, victimized by their own propaganda, like they wanted it to be true and thought they could shout it into being true. But for the record, though, I'm sure our listeners would like to hear how the CTU, would, or how you each actually would respond to statements like this, and maybe especially a little bit from President Sharkey about how the CTU mousetrapped Rahm with this claim.
I don't know if, the CTU gets the credit for Rahm's retirement. There's social movements in Chicago. Right. And I think what's been really interesting and important about the whole approach that we've taken is that we see ourselves organically connected to the movement of parents to speak up and have a voice about their schools, and the movement of young people of color to not be victimized by the police, and movements around immigration rights, and et cetera. That is to say, the clear attack line that DeVos makes, but it was certainly the line of Waiting for Superman and a whole kind of tradition of right-wing propaganda, is that somehow teachers are other. The interests of students and people who want a good education is over here, and the teachers are doing something different over there. And that just is not true. In the first case, teachers' working conditions are student learning conditions. And you can't draw, if you're thinking about it like logically, in terms of real world application of it. If I've got a classroom with no resources and teaching and have too many students in front of me, and there's no social workers and no library, et cetera, that's going to make school worse for students. But it's also the case that if unions are democratically led and not afraid to fight the people in power, we will have been raising the demands about what's being needed in our schools all along. So go back to the way we started off this interview, which is like, what does privatization look like? And I said, well, we've been making complaints about the dirty condition of our schools all along. Well, that becomes important because people then have to decide who they trust to actually advocate for their students. And if the teachers' unions are being polite or quiet or looking to make accommodations with the folks that run things and looking to be part of trying to maintain power and therefore maintain respectability among the powerful, and don't speak up about that, there is a lot of room where people can put a wedge between us and parents, because parents will notice the things that are wrong with their schools. But in situations like we had in Chicago, where we had actually been speaking up about school closings and speaking up about school privatization and speaking up about the lack of resources and speaking up about the dirty conditions, et cetera. And not just speaking up, but actually like pushing those protests and those demands for better conditions as far and as hard as we could, up until the point where like you go face to face with their supposedly democratic mechanism and expose that it isn't really democratic at all. And then people get to see who's really like behind the curtain and who's really pulling the strings. And that like the so-called school board that you have, which is an appointed board, you can present 200 people who can come out and speak about the problems, and they'll still vote unanimously against the thing which all 200 people were testifying about. So how can that possibly be democratic? And so I think that allowed us to build a movement. And I think it's like really important in thinking about this, that we be clear that this was never a situation where we sort of exposed their narrative and then won. You talk about the 12 strike. The 12 strike was important. In trade union terms, it was a losing strike. We were able to slow down and stop some of the worst elements of their attacks.
Right.
They tried to gut our contract. They gave us a 10-page contract. We have a mature collective bargaining agreement, that's been around for decades. And they said, okay, we're going to gut it. And we were able to fight that back and maintain a bunch of important elements, but not everything. We gave away things, or we lost things, I should say, in that strike. The CTU struck again in 2016 for a single day. We had not gone through the normal contract process. The labor board subsequently ruled that it was an illegal strike. People don't talk about it as much, but it was really around, there was a political standoff going on in the state about whether or not they were going to properly fund schools.
Right.
And so the CTU was engaged in a political strike about school funding in 16. We won a new funding formula in 17 that was finally pushed through the legislature. And it wasn't until 2019 that we actually had a strike where the added social workers, added counselors, fair pay, $35 million a year for class size improvements, enforceable class size language for the first time ever. A number of the demands that were sort of at the heart of the way we were articulating public interest in schools in that movement didn't actually come to fruition or show up in our contract until after what had been a decade-long struggle. And it's important to see the whole arc of it and to understand that that's actually what it took to win some gains in our contract. And I'm sorry to go on and on, but it just...
Oh, no, that's really very, very important for a number of different reasons, not the least of which is underscoring the protracted character of the fight that we're in, right? And the increments, and even the fact that you have to win some by losing some. Yes, Professor Moak.
Yeah, I was just reminded when President Sharkey was speaking, actually, I was transported back to high school where as teachers in my public high school, the Billings Education Association actually went on strike. And that was the first time I heard teacher working conditions are student learning conditions. And I think that's absolutely right. And if you look at what teachers have been fighting for in recent years, in addition to things like decent pay and benefits, is things like reducing class sizes, investing in school infrastructure, more support staff like counselors, librarians, school nurses, all of which directly positively affect student learning outcomes. But even if you just want to focus on teacher pay and benefits, many of the negative outcomes that we were talking about earlier, like massive teacher shortages due to low pay, and then the subsequent throwing out the window of the professional requirements and to fill these empty positions, are disasters for students, because you either have to end up raising class sizes or hiring unqualified people to fill those positions, which no sort of parent would really want to see happen. So even things like teacher wages and benefits, which critics tend to pawn off as selfish, are directly related to the best interests of students.
Right, absolutely. Well, look, I want to thank you both so much for your time and thoughtfulness, as well as for all the important work that you do for working people. I have one more question for you, President Sharkey, and then one for both of you that we like to ask all our guests on the Class Matters podcast. So, President Sharkey, can you describe CTU's public good approach to organizing and strong base of support with parents, and how you cultivate it and maintain it?
Yeah, basically, we think that our union has to be an organization, which is both, and as an organization, we need to both be and be seen as the organization which champions public schools and the communities that depend on public schools. So be and be seen as people who champion public schools and the communities that depend on those schools. Can't keep two sets of books on it. That means that internally we have to have real democracy. And because like 25,000 educators don't agree on stuff automatically, sometimes we get involved in it, where we have to wrestle through ideas.
Right.
And, I guess I think that if we do that, it puts us on the side of our students and our parents. And that's our best chance for actually winning things that like we need, our schools need, and people who depend on our schools need.
Thank you very much. And finally, for you both, as you know, the tagline for the Class Matters podcast is, what would the country look like if it were run by and for the working class? So what would K through 12 education look like from that perspective?
So I actually take a lot of inspiration from what teachers unions have been able to accomplish over the last few years. I think particularly in some surprising places like red states where you may not expect to see sort of these advances. So I think back to 2018 when you see teachers in West Virginia being able to win a 5% pay raise, not only for themselves, but for all public employees in the state of West Virginia, or in Oklahoma where you had per student expenditure that had been tanking, I think dropping by over a quarter since the Great Recession, and where you saw a number of schools reducing their teaching week to 4 days a week, in part because they didn't have the resources they needed, and sort of decades of tax cuts. Teachers were able to win the first tax raise in over 28 years by sort of organizing and pressing for some support public education and hiring more support staff for students. And in Arizona, where you see a similar sort of tanking of sort of per student expenditure since the Great Recession, teachers there were able to win significant wage increases and big reinvestment in education, all while simultaneously staving off proposals to pay for these by cutting other public goods like Medicaid and other sort of public services. I think these are sort of really important wins where teachers are connecting the value of education as a public good to public goods considered more broadly outside of schools as well.
Thank you. And President Sharkey?
Well, one thing I'd say is that if the working class ran a society, our schools would pay adequate attention to the needs of local communities, and that would show up in terms of our curriculum and what we teach and how we teach it. There's a huge debate going on around critical race theory, which is like, of course, urban students need to understand something about race. They're not white. 85% of the students in Chicago are Black and Latino. So the idea that you wouldn't teach Black and Latino students about the history of racism in the US or the history of race, etc., doesn't make any sense. Frankly, a lot of rural students, or students in other parts of the country need to know that too. We live in a multiracial society. But frankly, in rural schools, grew up in a part of the world where there's a lot of deer hunting. I would think that deer hunting should be a more important part of the curriculum, just because it was something that people felt strongly about, and you can actually teach people to think and to write and reflect. So that's one thing, is that I think that we should have culturally responsive curriculum. We really, that would be important, and it was something that would look like that would show up in our schools more. Second thing I think is that all of our schools will be well resourced. When you think about a wealthy suburb, people in the wealthy suburb are really happy to go to a great school. It's got great playing fields. It's got good academics. It's the place that all people's most cherished young adult memories are, run through it. Prom, the homecoming game, the social world around it, etc. All communities should be like that. And I think that if our schools are resourced that way, people wouldn't be asking for school choice. People don't have school choice. I don't like lots of different schools to go to in the suburbs. There's a good school, but it's a good school. And I think people should have that. So that would be a second thing that I would say about it. The third thing I'd say is if working class men in society, we shouldn't have we've got a weird kind of division line or set of walls, or literally in some cases security guards and metal detectors around our schools, so kids can't get out and people around the school can't get in. The truth of the matter is that young people are really a valuable and should be a treasure resource in our society, and people, the young people should be exposed to what adults do, should be able to get out of the school building and see work, and people who do interesting work or skills or whatnot should be able to be around young people for that. And, older societies had ideas about apprenticeships and whatnot, so that we didn't have such a weirdly generationally segregated off. I mean, like, I'm not saying there's no reason to have things called schools. We should have things called schools still, but like they would be way more integrated into our society, and we would have a much healthier view of young people and of human development, et cetera. More people would think about it. More people would lend their hand to those processes. So yeah, no, I think that we should be confident that our tradition would be way more, would be way more racially just. It would be way better for the development of young people. It would be way more fair, so that all different sections of our society would have a great education. And that's what I think it would be like to have education under a different kind of society.
Well, it sounds good to me. And I want to thank you both very much on the behalf of the Class Matters podcast, and take care and you keep up the good work, everybody.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Class Matters podcast. We were joined today by Jesse Sharkey, president of the Chicago Teachers Union, Daniel Moak, and Adolph Reed Jr. Our editor is Jimmy Wirt. You've been listening to the Class Matters podcast. You can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and support us on Patreon. Thank you for listening to Class Matters.